Are the arguments convincing that Dan McClellan employs against my lines of evidence for acknowledging an implicit rejection of female same-sex intercourse in the explicit Levitical prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse? Hi, my name is Robert Gagnon. I'm a visiting scholar of the Bible at Wesley Biblical Seminary in Ridgeland, Mississippi. This is part 4 of my series, responding to Dan McClellan's video, my final response to Robert Gagnon. McClellan's response to my video: is Dan McClellan right that ancient Israel accepted lesbianism? I am here picking up at the 8-minute mark of his video and responding ad seriatim to his key points till the 21-minute mark. Note that McClellan begins each of his responses with playing a clip from my video. In order for you to understand the context for his statements, it's necessary for me to include those excerpts from my own video. Here I'm in the midst of giving 4 lines of evidence that strongly indicate that we should read the prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse as implying a rejection of female same-sex intercourse. McClellan struggles to refute each one, foolishly leaving himself without any explanation for why he now concedes that
they probably would have rejected it as well.
I actually should have added a 5th line of evidence, which should have been number 2, the ancient Near Eastern context. That context shows that elsewhere in ancient Israel's milieu, unlike in ancient Israel itself, male same-sex intercourse was accommodated in various ways based on considerations of status differentiation, community affiliation, and voluntary engagement. The absolute rejection of male same-sex intercourse in ancient Israel, then, was clearly based in the first instance on sex differences, on male-female anatomical and physiological complementarity, not on status considerations, that is, male dominance. This makes an implicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse obvious. In the previous video, I dealt with the first line of evidence, the moral logic of the prohibitions of man-male sex. Now I begin with the second line of evidence that I gave in the recording to which McClellan is responding. Second, the historical context of ancient Israel indicates an implicit rejection of lesbianism. For example, Deuteronomy 22:5 states, quote, "A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is an abomination, toavah, to Yahweh your God." Think about it. If a woman wearing man's clothing is an abomination to Yahweh, how much more a woman who plays the role of a man in sexual intercourse?
But female same-sex intercourse does not necessarily require a woman playing the role of a man. And this was actually one of the reasons in the Greco-Roman world that they mocked and derided female same-sex intercourse. They referred to them pejoratively with a term that meant to rub, because they could not sexually penetrate each other. They could not play the role of a man.
So now it's okay to introduce an alleged parallel from the Greco-Roman world when McClellan does it, but not when I do it, or when Olyan does it. But since you bring it up, the discussions of female homoeroticism by male authors in the Greco-Roman world generally do portray one of the two women in a lesbian relationship as more masculinized than the other, in dress, mannerisms, hairstyle, aggressiveness, walk, talk, and sometimes in the use of a prosthesis, or of an overly large part of the female anatomy. And they are capable of tracing this female manliness to some congenital causation factor, though it doesn't excuse the behavior from being still regarded as, quote, contrary to nature. This is not unlike modern scientific notions that treat lesbianism as a risk factor for females who view other females as exotic to their own sex. Thus, for example, in the Greco-Roman period, the 2nd century AD astrologer Ptolemy of Alexandria refers to manly women born under a certain constellation who are, quote, lustful for sexual relations contrary to nature, unquote, and take the active role with women whom they sometimes call their, quote, lawful wives, unquote. Or the 2nd century AD satirist Lucian of Samosata, who tells of 2 rich women who regard themselves as married, the masculine Megilla of Lesbos and her wife, Demonassa the Corinthian. McClellan has no basis anywhere in the Greco-Roman male depictions of lesbianism for making the claim that he does about women not playing the role of a man. The use of the term rubbers is a term of derision, pointing out that they don't have the male equipment for penetration. But, contrary to what McClellan wrongly thinks, it is not used as a denial that women are trying to play the role of a man in lesbian intercourse, but only underscoring that it is foolish for them to do so. So McClellan's attempted rebuttal falls flat. As pointed out previously, though we have scant evidence from the ancient Near East regarding how sex between females was conducted, we do know that ancient Israel's prohibition of male same-sex intercourse is more strongly determined by the sex of the participants than it is by matters of active versus passive and dominance versus submission. That's why their prohibition against man-male intercourse is absolute, not moderated by status, community affiliation, age, or willingness. Thus, without a natural organ of penetration, it is possible to think of both women in an act of lesbian intercourse as in some sense playing the role of a man, simply by virtue of treating one's own self as a sexual counterpart to a female. Playing the role of a man isn't restricted to taking a dominant/active role. It includes any female who views herself or another female as sexually exotic and different to the female sex. Ironically, McClellan, in saying that lesbianism is rejected in the Greco-Roman milieu because a woman is anatomically incapable of penetration, lacking the proper male organ, is unknowingly making an argument based on anatomical complementarity, the very kind of argument he has just dismissed when I proposed it. Anatomical complementarity, the parts fit male to female, was not unknown to the ancients. With regard to the Greco-Roman world, to which McClellan has made an appeal, albeit a bad one, classicist Thomas K. Hubbard of the University of Texas, Austin, in his book Homosexuality in Greece and Rome, a source book of basic documents, published by University of California Press, observed, quote, basic to the heterosexual position against homosexuality is the characteristic Stoic appeal to the providence of nature, which has matched and fitted the sexes to each other, unquote. McClellan's pathetic attempt at discounting the relevance of Deuteronomy 22:5 on cross-dressing is disingenuous. Had this passage prohibited only men from wearing women's apparel, McClellan would be citing it as evidence for his position that the moral logic for a man wearing women's clothes does not apply to a woman wearing men's clothes. Homosexual practice is all about treating one's own sex as only half intact in relation to one's own sex, rather than in relation to the other sex, viewing oneself or one's partner as not fully the biological sex indicated by anatomy and physiology. It is on the same sexual spectrum as males who cross-dress as females and females who cross-dress as males in order to suppress their creator-designed sex. If females dressing as males is an abomination, it is obvious that females having sexual intercourse with other females is more so. The one just involves clothes, while the other involves sexual intercourse. McClellan's attempt at rebutting this transparent analogy underscores that his hesitation is based solely on LGBTQ dogma and not at all on the data. To assert that Deuteronomy 22:5 offers no parallel to Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 is to be governed solely by dogma. McClellan has no argument, and again, he offers no explanation of his own for why he now thinks that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected
female same-sex intercourse. Third, The later Greco-Roman view of lesbianism confirms the supposition of ancient Israelite rejection of woman-female intercourse. The Greek and Roman world rejected lesbianism nearly universally, far more widely than they rejected male homosexual practice. For those in the Greco-Roman world who embraced male homosexual practice, the reason was because the dominant role that it gave the woman on top. For those who did not embrace male homosexual practice, it was another example of how same-sex relationships was not an anatomical or procreative fit.
So the positions manifested in the later Greco-Roman world obviously have no relevance to reconstructing the view behind Leviticus 18 and 20. They are not yet influenced by Greco-Roman social convention and philosophical convention. So you can't retroject back into the past the influence of a culture that was absent from the composition and the worldview of Leviticus 18 and 20. So obviously that's not relevant.
McClellan hypocritically just attempted an albeit flawed argument from the Greco-Roman world about how
they mocked and derided female same-sex intercourse. They referred to them pejoratively with a term that meant to rub because they could not sexually penetrate each other.
Which McClellan wrongly contended meant that men in the Greco-Roman world could not charge them with playing the role of a man, though in fact they did charge lesbian women with doing just that, as I noted with examples. This underscores that McClellan will say whatever he feels dogmatically compelled to say in a vain effort at dismissing the biblical data. McClellan apparently doesn't even know what a history of religion or a history of culture parallel is, which historians, real historians, cite all the time. Let McClellan identify one culture in the ancient world that in prohibiting male same-sex intercourse did not also reject female same-sex intercourse. The fact that such a culture does not exist should tell McClellan something. But Dogma Dan is not a good historian when it comes to the issue of the Bible and homosexual practice. Fourth, the history of interpretation of the Levitical prohibitions of man-male intercourse suggests rejection of lesbianism.
So once again, Gagnon is taking later interpretations that have fallen under the influence of Greco-Roman social convention and philosophical convention, and he's trying to retroject it back onto Leviticus 18 and 20 to say, well, these interpretations must have been consistent throughout. They must have began exactly as they were when they were being expressed within the context of the Greco-Roman world, and that does not follow.
Again, McClellan doesn't act like an historian. History of interpretation is a reliable indicator when there are no contrary interpretations. When there is unanimity everywhere in early Judaism and early Christianity that female same-sex intercourse is a significant sin, and this lines up with history of religion or history of culture parallels, lines up with the closest parallels to the Levitical prohibitions in ancient Israel, and lines up with the moral logic of the prohibition of man-male intercourse in a society that, unlike the ancient Near East generally, makes no accommodations for male homosexual practice because it puts the sex of the participants over considerations of dominance/submission, then it is obvious that the authors of the prohibitions of man-male intercourse also viewed female same-sex intercourse as a significant sin.
This is like saying that because the prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was guilty, the prosecution has therefore proved he is innocent. But that's not the case, and that's why juries don't find people innocent. They just find them not guilty, meaning they have not been proven to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
We are discussing biblical interpretation here, Dan. This is not a criminal case or even a civil case, but as interpreters of the Bible, it's closer to a civil case than a criminal case. And in a civil case, the standard is not beyond a reasonable doubt, but rather a preponderance of the evidence. Not that there should be even reasonable doubt here. McClellan cannot name one society in the ancient world that views male same-sex intercourse as a high offense while viewing female same-sex intercourse positively. He has no case.
Gagnon knows the difference between these two things, but is just ignoring the difference because he needs to in order to make it sound like he's got even a plausible case.
Even a plausible case? Does McClellan not listen to his own admissions? In admitting that the authors of the Levitical Holiness Code
Probably would have rejected
female same-sex intercourse, just not as a capital sentence case, he is admitting that my view of things is at least probable, while his view that they would not
be universally condemning any and all homosexual practice because it conspicuously omits female same-sex intercourse
is probably wrong. I understand the difference between probably and reasonable doubt, but I don't think that he understands that he has admitted that his conclusion is probably wrong. And moreover, there is no reasonable doubt about the conclusion that I am drawing from the data. Paul includes an indictment of lesbianism in Romans 1:26, alongside an indictment of male homosexual practice in Romans 1:27.
And his position is also clearly irrelevant to understanding what Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 are actually prohibiting.
Not at all irrelevant. It is a history of interpretation commentary at a time much closer to the Levitical prohibitions and much closer to the social matrix than McClellan's own day. And there is nothing in it inconsistent with the Levitical prohibitions. The number of people in the history of interpretation who see the moral logic of the Levitical prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse as exempting female same-sex intercourse is, wait for it, 0.
But additionally, what else has fallen out of favor between Leviticus 18 and 20 and Paul, and largely as a result of the influence of the Greco-Roman world? Polygamy. That's another thing that has changed. Let's look at how Jewish authors in Greco-Roman period Judaism interpret the approbation and the endorsement of polygamy in the Hebrew Bible. They're against it. And that's not because they were against it all along, all the way back to the composition of those texts. It's because things change, interpretations change, values change, sexual ethics change.
Now that is a straw man argument. Nobody is arguing that things never change. Jesus himself indicated that God made an accommodation to human, chiefly male, hardness of heart, in allowing men the right of multiple wives and a unilateral right of divorce for almost any cause. Jesus closed that loophole. He didn't do so by appeal to developments in the Greco-Roman world. He did so by appeal to Genesis 1:27 and 2:24, the moral logic of which implies a basis for limiting the number of partners in a sexual union, whether concurrently or serially, to 2, based on God's intentional creation of a sexual binary, 2 and only 2 sexual counterparts, a male-female prerequisite. As I have already noted in this video, this is a completely different moral logic foundation than what existed in the Greco-Roman world, which found multiple ways of accommodating homosexual practice. Jesus also carried forward the moral logic to a conclusion that went well beyond the Greco-Roman world, rejecting polyamorous outlets with slaves, prostitutes, and rejecting any matter divorce and remarriage after divorce. See my 2 video critiques of McClellan's dogmatic claim that Jesus' remarks on marriage had no implications either for polygamy or for homosexual practice. There I also show that a moral logic for monogamy underlies the description of the creation of humans both in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2. McClellan is oblivious to the fact that the change in sexuality for Christians was not a random movement in any direction, but rather a change in direction to a more rigorous application of the moral logic of a male-female foundation and prerequisite for marriage, and thus for all sexual relations. Jesus did not need to change anything regarding homosexual practice, because all Jews rightly understood the scriptures to be rejecting strongly and absolutely any and all homosexual practice. He clearly sees a correlation between males having sex with males and females having sex with females. His statement, quote, even their females, underscores how deep the rot is in contemporary Greco-Roman society, when even females have debased themselves by engaging in same-sex intercourse, treating their sex as only half intact in relation to their own sex rather than the other sex. It's a good thing that we have Romans 1:26. Otherwise, McClellan would be saying, look, Paul used only the term arsenokoitai, men lying with a male, in 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10. So he must have no problem with lesbianism.
No. Again, this is a case of Gagnon saying, because I am pointing out that the jury did not find the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty, I must therefore be concluding that the prosecution proved the defendant to be innocent. I wouldn't say Paul must have had no problem with lesbianism, but if we did not have Romans 1, I would say Paul doesn't condemn female same-sex intercourse.
Exactly my point. You would be wrong if you concluded that, quote, Paul doesn't condemn female same-sex intercourse, unquote. Had Romans 1 been lost to history, you could say only that we have no explicit text where Paul condemned lesbianism, which is something that everybody would agree with. But to move from that statement of fact to the contention that
Paul doesn't condemn female same-sex intercourse
is another matter entirely, because it includes the assertion that Paul historically did not believe that lesbianism was wrong, not just that he didn't explicitly mention it in his extant letters. As it is, the historical case for Paul rejecting female same-sex intercourse, even in the absence of Romans 1:26, would still be overwhelming. The absence of an explicit prohibition in the extant ad hoc letters of Paul is no argument that Paul didn't condemn a given activity. Were it not for the case of the incestuous man at Corinth, see 1 Corinthians 5, McClellan would have to argue, by his logic, that Paul didn't condemn man-mother or man-stepmother incest, which would be ridiculous. Paul says not a word about man-sister or man-daughter incest, and not a word about bestiality. Does McClellan also want to make the historically preposterous statement that, quote, Paul doesn't condemn these behaviors? Instead of McClellan saying, quote, if we did not have Romans 1, I would say,
Paul doesn't condemn female same-sex intercourse,
which is contradictory and confusing. He should have characterized his position as, quote, if we did not have Romans 1, I would say Paul probably did condemn female same-sex intercourse, but the absence of an explicit prohibition to that effect leaves us in reasonable doubt, unquote. The fact that he presents himself as not seeming to know the difference between these two formulations underscores that he is either logic challenged or intentionally gaslighting.
He's trying to perform confidence, conviction, and competence for an audience who already agrees with him, does not know these data as well as he does, and just needs to be convinced that they are justified in their agreement. This is just a little rhetorical puppet show for people who don't know the data all that well and can't think that critically.
Couldn't have said it any better as regards what McClellan is doing for his own deluded fan base. The only one who is actually giving strong evidence for his position between McClellan and me is, well, let's just say it's not McClellan. McClellan is performing his own, quote, little rhetorical puppet show, as he puts it, for his groupies who aren't thinking critically. Instead, McClellan is being guided by LGBTQ dogma, not the historical data. And for this reason, he is taking his toys and going home where he can attack easy, low-lying fruit. He won't debate in a face-to-face forum on the subject of the Bible and homosexuality because he knows that his usual audience will be exposed to me effectively rebutting his positions. If he is really interested in having each side hear what the other side is saying, rather than each remaining in its own echo chamber, he should want to engage in a face-to-face debate with me. The fact that he doesn't want a face-to-face engagement, but I do, is testimony to the fact that it is he who wants to keep his side in ignorance about what he is doing. McClellan is bold in his videos when he can say what he wants without fear of me immediately refuting his weak arguments in the same video. He has even abandoned a back and forth exchange of videos because he knows that my video responses will reveal how uninformed and dogmatic his own positions are. McClellan has tried his abusive rhetoric on me as a strategy for winning in the absence of effective arguments. When he realized that I wouldn't let him get away with that, he reacted like a scared scholar and an intellectual coward. That's a typical MO for a bully. The Church Fathers also viewed female-female intercourse as sin.
Now, I'm going to skip over his citation of a number of texts from the early first millennium CE because, again, they're entirely irrelevant to what the authors and editors of Leviticus 18 and 20 were communicating versus what they omitted.
Actually, my referencing of texts from Church Fathers and from rabbis from the first centuries AD tells us precisely how these interpreters, much earlier than McClellan, would have applied the Levitical prohibitions of man-male intercourse, even to marriages between men and between women. They were applicable not only to lesbian relationships, but even committed lesbian relationships, semi-official marriages. And there is complete unanimity in the history of interpretation that there is a male-female prerequisite for sexual relations in the Hebrew Bible. Early Judaism, Jesus, Paul, Church Fathers, later rabbis, given not only the Levitical prohibitions of man-male intercourse, but also the creation texts, the abomination of the shrine guys in Deuteronomy and 1st to 2nd Kings who engage in man-male intercourse, the Sodom narrative and its interpretation by Ezekiel. I will demonstrate in a later video that McClellan gets these texts wrong, and the fact that every single narrative, law, proverb, exhortation, and poetry having anything to do with sexual ethics always presupposes a male-female prerequisite. The unanimity in the history of interpretation of the Levitical prohibitions that they do imply a prohibition of lesbianism arises from an overwhelming historical witness in the writings of ancient Israel. What is McClellan's evidence for it being otherwise? He has cited nothing. Indeed, what is he even arguing about if he already concedes that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected
lesbianism? Rather, there are multiple better explanations for why there is no mention of woman-female sex after man-male sex. The most obvious reason why woman-female sex is not explicitly mentioned, but female-animal sex is that woman-female intercourse did not involve penetration or transfer of semen, whereas sex between a woman and male animal, they believed, could entail such. Moreover, lesbian sex may have been viewed as a less severe offense than man-male intercourse precisely because of the absence of penetration as the primary definer of sexual intercourse, thus an evil, but not meriting the gravest penalty of capital sentencing. In addition, a society that is dominated by men and with a high view of female chastity that tightly controlled female lives, woman-female intercourse was not a significant concern.
And this is precisely the argument that I have made elsewhere, that they didn't think it was as big a deal, and because it doesn't involve penetration, there's no one taking the male role. As Gagnon said earlier, they obviously would have understood female same-sex intercourse to entail, and therefore would have condemned on the same grounds as their condemnation of male same-sex intercourse.
As I have already shown, there are many ways that a woman can, quote, take the male role in a lesbian relationship, as is clear from texts in the Greco-Roman milieu, a milieu to which McClellan himself has appealed, but drawn an erroneous conclusion. Moreover, any woman who sees herself as the sexual counterpart to another female, virtually axiomatic in lesbian relationships, is operating out of a deficiency in female self-identification and affirmation, hence a candidate for playing a male role. The absence of penetration may be a factor in downgrading the severity of lesbian intercourse from a capital sentencing case, but it is not an essential element for defining it as morally wrong, as even McClellan has to admit whenever he concedes, against his own conclusion, that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected it.
The authors of the Levitical Holiness Code do condemn female same-sex intercourse, quote, on the same grounds as their condemnation of male same-sex intercourse, unquote, namely on the same-sexness of the sexual relationship and the absence of a true sexual counterpart, whose body is reproductively organized as one part of a sexual whole, as the priestly text in Genesis 1:26-28 shows.
So Gagnon here is not only agreeing with the position that I have expressed elsewhere, he's arguing directly against himself.
4 points in response. First, how ironic. It is McClellan in his final response to me who,
arguing directly against himself,
when he finally had to admit openly to me, in the face of my arguments, that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected it as well.
That's why he offered not a single explanation for why he concedes that, namely, because he would be
arguing directly against himself.
Provide an explanation. Second, let me be clear once again that I didn't suggest an absence of penetration in female same-sex intercourse as one of the reasons for an absence of an explicit prohibition of lesbian intercourse because of anything McClellan said. I proposed it back in my 2001 book when McClellan was putzing around as an undergraduate. Third, I was not arguing directly against myself because, as I noted, a woman in a lesbian relationship can still attempt to, quote, play the role of a man in a reduced sense, even without having a natural organ for penetration. The authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 may have downgraded lesbian intercourse from a capital sentencing, but all the evidence indicates that it was still a serious offense. Fourth, let me explain something about what good scholars do. They go where the evidence leads. So way back in 2001, I of course could see that Leviticus 18 and 20 lacked an explicit prohibition of lesbian intercourse, but I could also see an array of data that strongly indicated that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 would have rejected lesbian intercourse. I recognize the dogmatic, unhistorical foolishness of claiming that the Levitical prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse did not imply a prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. I followed the evidence, whether it agreed with preconceived notions or not. McClellan should try that approach on the issue of the Bible and homosexuality, rather than formulating mutually contradictory claims based on a felt need to promote LGBTQ dogma. Note that same-sex female intercourse goes completely unmentioned in other legal materials from the ancient Near East, and that there are no female homosexual cult prostitutes in the ancient Near East generally, or Israel in particular. We do hear of male homosexual cult prostitutes, both in the ancient Near East and in periods of heretical rule in Judah and Israel. Indeed, a woman's proximity to males would have generated more controls and watchfulness than her proximity to animals on a farm.
As I have pointed out, there's a reason that Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 only contain one prohibition on a sexual partner that a woman may choose. And it's no coincidence that that is the one sexual partner that could actually be lower than a woman on the socially conventionalized hierarchy of domination, and that's an animal. Gagnon is agreeing with the position.
No, that isn't exactly my position. As I have already noted, McClellan's position is reductionistic and leaves out the problem of the same-sexness and the anatomical and physiological discomplementarity of such unions, as suggested indirectly by Genesis 1:26-28 and Deuteronomy 22:5. The natural inability to enter another with the appropriate complementary organ might downgrade the severity of lesbian intercourse to a non-capital offense, but based on all the other data that I put forward, including Deuteronomy 22:5, classifying cross-dressing as an abomination, a to'avah, it would still be a serious offense. The main issue is not social domination. That's the main issue in the ancient Near East, and later in the Greco-Roman world, where male same-sex intercourse is still accommodated in various ways, such as between social unequals. The absolute prohibition of male same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18 and 20 establish an even more significant concern, namely the discomplementarity of a same-sex union in terms of anatomy and reproductive physiology. The participants in such intercourse were simply not divinely designed for such. In short, the claim that woman-female intercourse would have been acceptable in ancient Israel is a far less credible interpretation of the data than the view that the condemnation of such behavior is implicit in the condemnation of man-male intercourse.
The notion that female same-sex intercourse is implicit in Leviticus 18 and 20 is not true. If the question were, how can we best reconstruct comprehensively the sexual ethic of the authors of Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, then we could answer that they likely would have had a problem with female same-sex intercourse, but likely not as severe a problem as they did with male same-sex intercourse.
McClellan simply doesn't know what he is talking about when he denies that a prohibition of female same-sex intercourse is implicit in the explicit prohibition of male same-sex intercourse. If it is not implicit, then what is the basis for McClellan conceding that
they likely would have had a problem with female same-sex intercourse?
You would think that in a 22-minute video response to me, claiming that I have straw-manned and wildly misrepresented his position, he would give some sort of reason for now divulging, for the first time to me at least, a view that he had not divulged in 95 minutes of video responses to me, nor even in his one book chapter on the Bible and homosexuality. But he doesn't. Why? Because it would undermine his one-trick pony argument. That's why. As I have argued, the reason for the rejection of female same-sex intercourse is indeed implicit in the reason for the absolute rejection of male same-sex intercourse. McClellan's monumental failure to account for the cross-cultural difference between the absolute rejection of male same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 and the partial accommodation to male same-sex intercourse in the ancient Near East and later the Greco-Roman milieu undermines his entire argument. He has absolutely no explanation for it. In fact, he simply ignores it, as he does everything else inconvenient for his interpretation of the Bible and homosexuality. Here, in saying both that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
likely would have had a problem with female same-sex intercourse,
and that
the notion that female same-sex intercourse is implicit in Leviticus 18 and 20 is not true.
He is espousing two mutually contradictory statements, and he is expecting that you, dear listener, will not pick up the glaring inconsistency.
The question is, what does Leviticus 18 and 20 condemn? It does not condemn female same-sex intercourse, whatever their actual position on that.
As I have been saying throughout, his question, quote, what does Leviticus 18 and 20 condemn, is intentionally ambiguous, and he plays off the two different senses that he gives the phrase in his responses to me. He plays them off because it is to his dogmatic advantage to do so, until someone comes along who can expose to the light his trickery and gaslighting. No one is contesting that Leviticus 18 and 20 lack an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse, just as they lack an explicit prohibition of incest with one's daughter and with one's full sister. The issue is what contention one extrapolates from this absence. That is the critical point of disagreement between McClellan and me, as McClellan must know, despite all his gaslighting.